Hi, Greg. It looks like it's just about 1 o'clock. Would you like to get started?
Okay. Am I starting, Zach, or are you?
If you go to the next slide, I can start with some housekeeping tips.
Okay.
So, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Before we begin, I just wanted to share a few Zoom-related logistics. First, this meeting is being recorded, and you can find a copy of today's presentation in the chat box. If you are having any technical issues, you can send all questions to zachary.armand@erg.com, the address listed on the screen. Please submit all other questions in the Q&A box. We will be addressing these throughout the webinar. In order to minimize background noise, all attendees are on mute. And now I'd like to hand things back over to Greg.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Hopefully, you've come to hear about the proposed construction general permit that EPA proposed about a month ago. Just relax. This is not the most exhilarating material in the world, but hopefully this will be informative to you if you are someone who's is subject to the permit, is following these issues, or you're in a state that's paying attention to EPA's permit. Just in terms of the material in the presentation, we like to just remind folks that these are PowerPoint slides. They're summaries of the permit. They're not the official proposal. If there's any differences between the language and the slides and the permit, the permit governs. But hopefully this presentation will give you a high-level summary of some of the things that we wanted to put before you all. And if you are planning on commenting, this will be of some assistance to you. So just wanted to say that. I'm going to be mentioning a few abbreviations throughout the presentation, and I just wanted to upfront just say what some of those are. We use CGP all the time. That's you should understand that to be EPA's construction general permit, but we just call it CGP for short. States have their own CGPs, but when we refer to the CGP here, we're talking about the EPA permit. There's also something called a SWIP, the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. Every construction site is required to have a written plan on how they're going to comply with the permit. And most of you all are probably very familiar with that, but we don't spell that out anywhere else. There's also an NOI and an NOT for the CGP. There's a way of getting covered under the permit where you submit an online form. It's called a notice of intent. It's used for any kind of general permit, but we refer to it as an NOI. And then NOT, once you've completed construction, you've done all the things that the permit requires you to do before leaving the site, you submit an NOT or notice of termination, and that ends your coverage under the permit. So those are some abbreviations you might see. Things to keep in mind overall. The presentation today is focused really on what's changing from the previous permit. We're not going to do a nuts and bolts CGP overview. Really, we wanted to highlight just the changes. So hopefully that makes sense. But if you have questions about other requirements in the permit and we have time, we're happy to go over those. The other thing, secondly, is that when we go about changing a permit, or proposing, in this case, the change of a permit, there's a process we go through. We don't just come up with these things that we feel like putting in the permit. We went through a process here where we reached out to different stakeholders, states, and regulated construction people in the industry. We talked to states and our own inspectors and permit writers as well. And what resulted from that was a list of things that we either needed to clarify in the permit or to change. So that's how that has arisen. Also keep in mind the bulk of the permit that exists right now, if you're familiar with it, is not changing. The modifications we're looking at are things that are focused on very specific issues or clarifications. And then lastly, one of our kind of thoughts here is that we're hoping that people will read the permit, comment on it, and provide feedback. That's how we learn, how this is going to impact you all in the real world. So that's my pitch for you all to comment. And in terms of the presentation ahead, I'm gonna give you a little bit of the background of the CGP in general. I'll give you a quick primer on how to review and comment on the permit if you're so inclined. And then we'll get into the changes that we're gonna summarize today. And then also there's areas in the permit that we're requesting comments, so I'll review those. And then what we're planning on doing today is stopping during intervals of the presentation, and we'll just see if there's any questions that you all are posing through the Q&A feature. And we'll also just at the end see if there's any other questions as well. So hopefully that works. Okay, so getting into the background of the CGP. The permit itself is a result of how do we regulate construction stormwater discharges is a function of what the Clean Water Act tells us we have the authority to regulate. So there's language in the Clean Water Act that spells out that we have authority to regulate certain industrial sites and construction sites. And then there in the middle tier here, there's right here, there's a set of regulations that define what we can regulate. And here you'll see all these numbers here. Basically, they're defining what size construction site we regulate. And in the case of construction, I'll go over that in a minute, but it's 1 acre and above. And then I'll also go over this part that says 40 CFR 450.21. These are the minimum federal standards for that have to be included in any permit. And then lastly, there's the CGP that's issued based on the regulations, based on the statute. This is actually our seventh CGP that we are issuing this time around. And so we've been at this for a while, and each 5 years we take another look at what needs to change. Okay, what is regulated? What we regulate is construction activity, stormwater discharges from construction activity. And I mentioned that that we define what's regulated, and that over time that has been established to be 1 acre of land or more disturbance, or smaller disturbances that are part of a common plan of development. You can think about a residential subdivision that is being built over time, but they're built in 1/4 acre chunks, and that individually aren't an acre, but over time are over an acre. So those would be regulated as well. And basically a Clean Water Act permit is required, typically a general permit. And what is construction activity? We define it as any earth disturbing activity, but we typically shorten that to be clearing, grading, or excavating, or other construction related activities. Other construction related activities could be regrading of roads, placement of raw material at the site, stockpiling of fill material. There's other things that involve disturbances to the surface that could measure 1 acre or more, and those would require a permit. There's also minimum federal standards that EPA put out in the mid 2000s. These are referred to as the C&D rule requirements, or construction and development rule. They are made up of narrative requirements, and these are requirements to EPA and the states to basically include these 5 minimum things that I've listed here. They're essentially pretty commonly used principles. And then what happens is the permit writers are given the ability to elaborate on what's meant by some of these things. So for instance, the first one is design, install, and maintain effective erosion and sediment controls and pollution prevention measures. Those are often spelled out in more detail in the permits. But you'll also recognize in other permits and in EPA's permit, there's a deadline for stabilizing sites. That's 14 days. That's established by federal standard. There's also language about dewatering, which I'll go into in a little bit. There's language about prohibiting the discharge of certain wastewaters and chemicals and other substances that we don't want getting into the waste stream. And so that's where we get into pollution prevention measures as part of the construction permits. And then lastly, this number 5 here applies to if you're using a stormwater basin of some kind, there's a direction to utilize outlet structures that withdraw water from the surface. So you'll see that in just about every permit that's out there. We like to think of the CGP as being made up of 4 different kind of bins of activities. You're preparing, you're getting covered, you're taking action, and you're stabilizing. The first step is to prepare. You need to make sure that you've got a construction activity coming up, a project. You would check to make sure you're eligible. Basically, make sure you're in an area where the CGP applies, you're disturbing 1 acre or more. You also need to develop a SWIP for your site to comply with the permit. And then you're submitting your notice of intent, the NOI form that I mentioned before. You do that online. The result of that is you get coverage under the CGP for the length of your construction project. Undertaking action, the permit's going to require you to install stormwater controls, to conduct inspections and take corrective actions, and then document your inspections and any maintenance that you're performing or fixes that you're conducting to the stormwater controls. Those are also requirements. And then once you're finished, there's requirements to stabilize the site within a set amount of time, 14 days. And once you've done that, you submit your notice of intent to terminate coverage. That's kind of the cradle to grave on the CGP. I mentioned that, that there's areas of the country where the CGP applies. EPA is the permitting authority for the CGP. All but 3 states have their own authority. So we're looking at a map here, and all these bluish gray state boundaries that aren't highlighted in any way. They have their own permitting programs. They have their own CGPs. And so we're not writing a permit that's effective there. We're writing a permit that's effective in New Mexico, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. DC, Puerto Rico, most Indian country lands, federal facilities in Washington, Colorado, Vermont, and Delaware, and US territories. So that's important to keep in mind. If you're someone who's operating in another state that's not affected by the permit, I will say that sometimes states tend to look to EPA's permit. They are not required to include the same requirements, but sometimes they do. So I would say keep that in mind as well. Okay, just a few words on reviewing and commenting on the proposed permit. the proposed permit was published on May 12th of this year. You can find all of the materials on our website, which I've included here. And I wanted to mention, Zach mentioned that the presentation materials are available to you. So don't feel like you have to write all this down very quickly. I hope it helps to have the slides, but these websites are here for you to find the permit, the fact sheet, and other materials that you'll need for your review. There's a 60-day comment period that ends July 12th. Keep that in mind. After July 12th, we will not be able to accept comments. And the way you submit comments is through what we call the docket, but there's a website called regulations.gov, which I'll go over in a few minutes. When you are reviewing the permit, a lot of the pages will look something like this. This is one section of the permit where we were making a lot of changes. A lot of the pages don't look like this, but basically we're showing any modifications that exist from that are proposed changes from the current permit to what we're proposing to finalize and we're asking for comment on. And this is the permit, but we also use this same format in all the different appendices, like the NOI and NOT form. There's a few changes there. We also have 8 specific requests for comments. You were able to comment on any aspect of the CGP that you wish to, but we're also asking for specific feedback in 8 different areas. And you'll see this in the permit highlighted in blue like this one is. Okay, I mentioned submitting comments. Basically, you're gonna go to a site called regulations.gov, which is here. And you're gonna plug in this number here, EPA -HQ, all the way up through 0169. This is our docket number. Once you enter that in, it'll give you some options, and you'll want to select the one that shows the 2022 issuance of the general permit for stormwater discharges from construction activities, the CGP. There's a lot of stuff on this site that we've put on there for folks to look at that include things like the economic analysis. There's a couple other research things that we put together. Any documents that we relied on to put together the proposal should be available. And if there's something that you don't find there, just let us know and we'll try to get that to you. But once you plug in this number here, you'll get a second screen here. This is basically the comment field where you'll have the ability to write your comment. You can write it directly into the fields here, I believe. Sorry, this is a little small, but you can start typing your comment there, or you can attach a file. It's pretty straightforward. A number of you have probably already used this before. Just wanted to show that to you if that's of any use. Let me pause there before I start diving into the changes and see if we've got any questions that are geared towards the slides I've gone over so far.
I don't see any questions relating to the slides so far, but I just want to remind people that if you can't see the slides within the chat box, the recording and the slides, current plans post them on EPA's website at a later date.
Okay, Zach, did you say there's no questions so far? I should just keep going?
I'm seeing none at the moment.
Okay. All right, well, I'll dive into the next section. So here's this next set of slides, and most of the rest of the presentation actually is about some of the proposed changes that we're highlighting. These aren't every single change, but just the ones that we thought were the most substantive. And so just know that there are some other changes. And if there are ones that you'd like us to talk about, just ask us during the presentation. Okay, the first set of changes have to do with the stormwater controls that are required as part of the CGP. And these are mostly pretty focused, targeted, I would say, not the not the most not the biggest set of changes out there, but the first one has to do with perimeter controls. And understand a perimeter control to basically be a sediment control that's used along the downslope side of the outer perimeter of your construction disturbance. The existing permit, which we refer to as the 2017 CGP, required that you install these perimeter controls, and that and then there's also some requirements about maintaining those controls, and there's a specific requirement about removing sediment if it has accumulated to 1/2 of the above ground height of the control. What we were looking to do in the proposal was, we had heard that there have been some pretty common problems with maintenance and incorrect installation. So we wanted to highlight or emphasize a few things. These aren't changing the fundamental requirement to have a perimeter control, but some of the things that came up, there was a question among the regulated industry about, well, if you have a buffer, and I'll back up for a second, the CGP requires that you have something called a natural buffer around surface waters. So if you have a waters of the United States that flows through your construction site, or is immediately adjacent to it, then there's requirements about leaving a certain amount of land or using specific controls that basically are the equivalent of a 50-foot buffer. The question relating to perimeter controls was, do you also need a perimeter control if basically your disturbance goes right up to the buffer? The answer, and we clarified in the permit that the answer is yes, you need a perimeter control, with a few exceptions, up gradient from the natural buffer. There's a role that the perimeter control plays in filtering sediment that we feel is an important principle, in addition to having the buffer, which is really a last line of defense for pollutant control. We also included some specifics about installation and maintenance. Here we're specifying that if you're on a sloped area, you should install the perimeter control on the contour and with both ends bent upslope, so that stormwater isn't circumventing around the control. Also, if there is evidence after storms that the stormwater has circumvented the control, or it's undercut the control, to extend or repair undercut areas to fix the problem. So those are pretty standard things that you would find in most BMP manuals. We felt it was important to emphasize these requirements, and hopefully, well, you can comment on those, but hopefully those are fairly reasonable and common practice out there. The next type of change we made, and again, these are two stormwater controls that are in the CGP, is that has to do with stabilization. I mentioned before that there's a time frame for stabilizing construction disturbances once the project is done, or if you're even taking a temporary, if you're ceasing construction for a period of 14 days or more, you need to stabilize. When you're leaving the site at the end, final stabilization, currently under the 2017 CGP, there's no additional requirement to ensure that that's taken place. We've been hearing a lot from our inspectors that stabilization is frequently inadequate, and we would like to address that. And one of the ways we thought would be reasonable would be to ask for permittees to submit photographs of the stabilized site. And this is something that you can do electronically with the NOT form. We're asking for comment on that, but basically we're not thinking of anything more sophisticated than photos you can take with your mobile phone. But we're also asking for comment on whether you believe there's any criteria we should be putting in place around that to just ensure that the photos are accurate, that they're representative and of good quality, or any other considerations you think we should have in there besides just requiring photographs. Okay, it's not letting me change here. Okay, and then another change that we're making to sediment controls, this has to do with pollution prevention. If you're storing chemicals or petroleum products, some kind of liquid chemical of some kind, the existing permit requires that you have a watertight container and that you either cover it or you have some similarly effective means of minimizing pollutant discharge. What we heard from outside the agency, mostly from industry, is that it's that it might be more useful to have a breakdown in terms of the controls based on the relative volume that you have on site. You might just have a small amount of chemicals stored on site, so maybe you don't need something as big as a cover. You can kind of handle pollution prevention in a contained area. We thought that that was a good idea that would hopefully improve implementation. We looked around and found that there was some precedence for this in our oil pollution prevention regulations. So we propose that if you've got 55 gallons or less of chemical or petroleum product on site, that there's a different set of requirements than if you have more. And in the case of, and what we propose is that if you have 55 gallons or less, you have a spill containment pallet that you use to store the containers on, and have a spill kit available. Also, all the containers would, of course, need to be watertight as well. And if you're more than 55 gallons, we specified that the containers must be kept 50 feet or more away from waters or drainage systems, and that you provide either cover or secondary containment. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. The next set of requirements have to do with dewatering. I'm also going to stop here before we get into dewatering because there's a number of slides here, and just see if, Zach, if we've gotten any questions on the previous slides.
Sure. So one question is, what is the not photo submission expectation for projects subject to the arid, semi-arid stabilization exceptions?
Okay. I'm assuming that that is asking about the arid and semi-arid changes that we're proposing. And if that's the case, I am going to be talking about that in a little bit in the inspection section. But basically, folks should know that if you are in an arid or semi-arid area or a drought-stricken area, there are different inspection and stabilization requirements. And I'll go over that in a little bit, but just understand that there is specific flexibility if you're in one of these areas. So for now, I'm probably just going to ask if we can wait until we get to those and see if there's any questions based on that stuff.
Yeah. I think the question was referring specifically to the NOT requirement to submit photo final stabilization, and if that may be different for projects subject to the arid, semi-arid exceptions.
Right. That's a great question, because the stabilization requirements for arid and semi-arid areas and is that it's slightly different. You have to initiate stabilization on the same time frame as everyone else, but you're given longer to establish. If you're doing vegetative, you have longer to have that become fully established. And that's a good question. I think that would be a good area for comment. I think we were silent in that proposal about that, but I would think at a minimum, the photographs would need to be would need to represent the and this is just if you're doing vegetative stabilization, and it's going to take longer in these dry areas, that you'd at least want to have photographic capture the non-vegetative stabilization that you've put down that's there in the meantime. So, but I would encourage folks that are focused on that issue to submit suggestions about that. I think that's a good area for comment. Thanks.
Okay.
Any others, Zach?
Yeah, there's looks like 3 more questions. The next one is, why are photos being suggested for the NOT? Isn't signed certification enough to document NOT?
Right. Well, I don't think I went into any great detail about the background behind this, but what we've found is, and of course there is a certification on the NOT, and among the things that you're certifying is that you have stabilized the site and that you've met the requirements of the permit. So our existing permit and the permits before that have relied on that certification. The thinking behind the proposal was that because we're finding that there are a significant number of sites that aren't meeting these requirements, that an additional level of assurance is necessary here. A photo is easy to take. It's something that gives us kind of an extra layer of confidence because of the importance of stabilization. If it's wrong and it's raining, a significant amount of sediment can be discharged. So we want, as an agency, to ensure that permittees are getting that done correctly. So that's kind of my thought on why we're adding that in.
Thanks. There's
Zach, I just wanted to add, obviously this is an area that you can comment on, whether you think that photographs are necessary, whether what problems might be associated with that, but that's where we came out in the proposal.
Thanks. There's another question. I don't think that I have ever filed an NOT. Usually project is complete and coverage just runs out over time. Would this still be the case? Clients don't normally look to pay for filing NOTs in my experience.
I'm sorry, Zach, I couldn't hear the last part. Can you speak up just a little bit?
Sure, I'll reread the question. I don't think that I have ever filed an NOT. Usually project is complete and coverage just runs out over time. Would this still be the case? Clients don't normally look to pay for filing NOTs in my experience.
Right. Well, one thing I would say, the NOT has been in the permit for just about every one of the CGPs. So this is not a change. I understand that some people might skip that step. I would say I would encourage you not to. That's kind of part of the whole. It should be seen as part of the whole permit compliance or the cost of complying with the permit. And the other thing is that it's not a form that takes a lot of time. It could be that the person asking the question, that it's hard to get the people to sign the form, that there's work involved and there's administrative work involved in that, and I understand that. The form itself is a few check boxes and that's it. So we tried to keep it pretty stripped down on purpose, but understand the concern. I don't really have a great answer for you though.
Thanks. The next question is, C. I understand several EPA delegated states, Arizona, Minnesota, Colorado, allow builders to submit their NOT without completing stabilization provided temporary stormwater controls are in place. For example, if the homeowner wants to perform specific landscaping afterwards, will EPA's final CGP reflect this option?
We do have something similar to that if you're in an arid, or semi-arid or drought-stricken area, that you're able to use non-vegetative stabilization controls and determine coverage. You don't need to retain coverage for the next 3 years or however long it will take. So that will, we weren't proposing to change that, I would say. And if I haven't answered your question on any of these, feel free to email or get in touch afterwards.
Sure. And we have a couple questions, so cut me off whenever and maybe we can come back to them or address them after.
Okay.
But next question is photos for NOT land and building construction. How will we be able to send pictures to local and state EPA that can't receive photos to them?
How will they send it? Is that the question?
I believe so.
Okay. We're going to make it so that you can submit photos, and there's a certain size limitation to what the electronic system can accept, but I think it's pretty large. So as long as you've got them in an electronic format, we're going to figure out how that's submitted, but I think it's pretty straightforward to do that. Did I get it? The question, was there any other part of it?
Without knowing the intent too much, it seems to cover it.
Okay.
I'd also just like to remind everyone in attendance that the PDF slides are in the chat box. If you are unable to view them, it might be a specific issue with your Zoom client. That being said, the recording and PDF slides will be posted online at a later date. The next question is, if a site meets the criteria for permit coverage, but discharges to a non-jurisdictional, quote, water defined in 40 CFR 120.2, is permit coverage in SWIP still required by EPA?
Oh, that's a doozy. This isn't something I can really answer with a lot of specificity. There's a lot of basically, if you're discharging to some kind of ditch or something that's been recently made non-jurisdictional, is that still considered a discharge to the waters of the U.S.? I would say that in general, that if there's a downstream connection, this is also going to be degrees of how far, and we didn't answer this question in the definition of the Waters of the United States rule, but there's going to be questions of distance. There is, I know some of the intent behind that was to that if there is a downstream connection to a jurisdictional water, that you would still be regulated. But this is a really difficult question to answer with any specificity, kind of apart from knowing the specifics. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thanks. And in the interest of time, I might suggest we continue the presentation and come back to some of these questions afterwards.
All right, thanks, Zach. I'm gonna jump into an area of emphasis in the proposed permit. This has to do with dewatering. I mentioned before that the federal standards for construction sites, they have language about dewatering. So all permits have to address in some respect dewatering if it's occurring on a regulated construction site. But just to step back for a minute, what is dewatering? It's basically the process of draining stormwater that's been ponded on the site or groundwater that's in excavations, foundations, vaults, whatever, that needs to be removed to make the site buildable, essentially, to ensure that structures placed on the land will be able to maintain their physical integrity, just to remove that water. The issue is, of course, that water needs to go somewhere, and it's discharged off the site. We have covered these discharges under our previous CGPs, and we have requirements, which I'll go over in a bit. But basically, the issue with dewatering discharges is that they need to be, unlike, they're not like the classic stormwater discharge like we're used to thinking about for construction sites. These are controlled discharges. They can be shut off and shut on. They can be large volumes, can be quite intense. One of the biggest concerns with dewatering discharges is just the sediment that can be contained in there. And we've seen on some sites that if you have several hours of a controlled discharge of dewatering water, it can produce more sediment than might be otherwise discharged from an entire construction site over the course of the project. There's a concern about water quality. And again, the most common pollutant of concern here is sediment. Some of these pictures are from some of the sites that EPA has inspected under the CGP. You can see that something's going wrong here. I think there was a sense among EPA and its implementation activities that this is an area that, given the current controls, we should take another look at to see if there's things that we can clarify or strengthen. What we wanted to do first is to look around and see what the other states were doing. They either regulate dewatering discharges as part of their CGP, like EPA does, or they regulate them in a specific dewatering permit. What we found is that a number of states have controls that are stricter than what EPA has. They have numeric effluent limits, a number of them. And by the way, a lot of this is captured in our fact sheet that supports the permit. So if you're interested in this, you might check that out. But also a number of permits require effluent monitoring, and some have daily inspections. And some of these are some of the considerations we had in thinking about how to modify our permit. I'm going to go over some of the areas that the proposed permit is modified from the current permit. The first area is that we're using greater specificity to describe the dewatering controls. The current permit requires, and this is this stuff here, requires that you treat dewatering discharges to minimize pollutant discharges. And there's general guidelines that you can, if it's uncontaminated and non-turbid, you don't need controls. There's also requirements having to do with oil, water, basically oil and grease removal, and controls dealing with velocity dissipation, and that has to do with erosion. What we're looking to do in the proposal is to clarify that all dewatering water must be routed through a sediment control designed to prevent discharges with visual turbidity. And we'll get into what visual turbidity is in a minute, but basically it's visual cloudiness in the water that looks like a sediment plume. We're also excluding coverage for dewatering discharges from contaminated sites, which we define as being sites that are considered a Superfund site or that are part of a RCRA cleanup site. If your site is on there, you would not be able to be covered under the CGP to discharge dewatering water. You'd need a separate permit. Other requirements that are related to controls have to do with just specifying that the discharge cannot cause a visible sheen or hydrocarbon deposits on the bottom or shoreline of the water body, and also to prevent erosion, to use stable erosion resistant surfaces. Don't place the controls on a steep slope, and the discharge shouldn't be causing resuspension of sediments. So those have to do with the controls for dewatering. We also include some modifications for inspections. In the current permit, we don't have dewatering specific requirements, but in the proposal, we are, now not all sites are going to be dewatering, by the way, I should say. So just keep in mind that if this doesn't affect you, if your project isn't dewatering, these aren't things that you would need to comply with. But if you are dewatering, the proposal would have there be daily inspections, which among other things, you'd be looking to make sure that, or you'd be looking to document when the discharge began and ended, to estimate the rate of discharge, whether you're seeing a sediment plume or visible sheen, and to take photographs of the dewatering water, both prior to and after treatment, as well as the treatment control and the point of discharge. These photos are different from the photos we were talking about with stabilization. These are just things that you would keep on site with your inspection records. So that's inspections. Another thing with dewatering is corrective action. So if you see a problem, what are you supposed to do about it? I mentioned that in the inspection, the proposal is to look for a sediment, if there is a sediment plume or visible sheen of some kind, or a deposit of some kind that that you see or that you've been informed is out there, then you would take what's called corrective action to do, among other things, immediately suspend the discharge and try to go fix the problem, figure out what's causing the problem and fix it. Okay, so those are all the changes that are proposed. We're also requesting comment on some measures that have to do with protecting sensitive waters. So when we think of sensitive waters, we're thinking of waters that are impaired for sediment or that are considered high quality waters. Those are waters that have been labeled by the state to be tier 3 waters or tier 2 waters. In the past, we haven't had specific additional requirements for sensitive waters, but here we're asking for comment on whether it makes sense to impose to add a turbidity monitoring requirement for permittees. So if you are discharging to a sensitive water and you're dewatering, we're asking for comment on measuring turbidity during the discharge. And I'm going to go into this in a little bit of detail, but we're looking at two potential options, whether to have a benchmark monitoring approach or just an indicator monitoring approach. And I'll explain what those are in a second. Just to back up a little bit about turbidity, when we talk about turbidity, we're thinking of something that's visually obvious. It refers to a sediment plume that you can see or cloudiness. Turbidity has been found to be an effective indicator of whether your construction site controls are working or not. It's easy to measure. There are portable turbidity meters that you can purchase that they range in price, but average around $1,000. But they're easy to use, and they're also you get results instantaneously, and they basically measure what's called NTUs or nephelometric turbidity units. And this is a measure of the amount of light that comes off of a water sample, and it's a function of suspended matter or suspended sediment in this case. So it can be effective to use for pollutant controls. I mentioned that there's two options that we're asking for comment on. The first option would be called a benchmark monitoring approach. When we say benchmark, what we're thinking about here is that you're comparing the level of turbidity to a established level that is considered either a good level or not so great. And based on that, then maybe you might need to do some additional work to lower the sediment levels. But basically, this approach would have the permittee that's discharging dewatering on any day that they're discharging to monitor once per day from the discharge point. This would be after the treatment occurs. They would compare the average turbidity level to an established benchmark. I should mention that in the permit, there's a request for comment that you'll see. It's in section 3.3, and it goes into some of these details, but the benchmark we were contemplating or proposing is 50 NTU. I'll get into that in a minute. The idea is that you'd have you'd collect these every day, and then you'd average the levels that you get for the week and compare it to the benchmark. And if it exceeds the benchmark, then you would be required to do corrective action to figure out the source of the problem if you can, and to make any necessary repairs or upgrades to lower the turbidity levels. And then also you'd have this data built up, and you would submit quarterly monitoring reports to EPA, and you can do that electronically. In terms of the benchmark of 50, we did some research into this, and this picture is showing you kind of what 50 or nearabouts. I couldn't find a 50 NTU, but 55 NTU looks like that sample there in the middle, which is starting to get cloudy. But 50 NTU was within the range of state standards that had specific numbers. They don't all have specific turbidity numbers, but it seemed to be in the range there. 50 is also the number that's used in the industrial stormwater permit, which we call the MSGP. Excuse me. The limited, we did also ask the states for data that they might have from permittees, and 50 seemed to be at a level that most sites were able to achieve, at least based on the limited data that we saw. The alternative would be to use whatever state standard applies in the area of the site. The problem with that is that most states where the CGP is effective rely on a standard that's based on the natural background level of turbidity. So they'll say something like Class B water shall not exceed naturally occurring conditions by more than 10 NTUs. We thought about that. The problem would be that you would need to also have background turbidity data, and the benchmark would change for every site. So we thought from a program standpoint that would be very difficult to implement. The other option, the first option would be the benchmark. The other would be to have permittees collect this data and report it in the same way that they would under option 1, but there wouldn't be a benchmark. This would be, for at least this permit term, we would just be collecting data that would give us an understanding of how effective treatment controls are, and to also give operators an understanding of what turbidities coming off of these discharges. We're also asking for comment on some other areas. Essentially, are you supportive of including monitoring in general, just as an overall matter for dewatering discharges? Do you have a preference for either option 1 or 2? And if you've done turbidity monitoring on construction sites before, tell us a little bit about what that's been like. What instruments did you use? Did you find it to be reliable to know the level, and did making changes based on the turbidity level end up working to reduce turbidity? Did you report or just keep the records on site? Did you rely on a contractor to do this work, or did you do it yourself? And how much did it cost? So you'll see these are all things that are in the permit. And if this is something that you have an opinion about, we encourage you to submit comments on. I'm going to stop there again, since that was a lot, and just see if there's any questions about dewatering or anything else.
Sure. We have quite a few questions, so I'll just work my way through them and stop when we have to. One question is, will turbidity limits take into account what background levels are? I.e., can we subtract out background turbidity for purpose of compliance?
Not under the approaches we described, but under the benchmark approach, it would just be, are you above or below? However, if what the commenter is saying, they think that's a better approach, we'd be willing to obviously consider any comments about that.
Thanks. Another question is, for benchmark monitoring quarterly reports, would these be submitted via CDX CGP program? How would EPA or the operator know a quarterly report is due? How would a late report or no report be considered a corrective action or enforcement action? Would the reporting structure follow the discharge monitoring report format on the MSGP slide?
Those are all great questions.
Sorry,
we're actually meeting about that. Sorry, those are all great questions. And Zach, just tell me if I've missed anything. But if we went forward with monitoring, the reporting would be through. We're thinking it would be something that you would use. You would interface with the same platform that you do for your NOI and NOT. In terms of being reminded when to do it, so if the requirement was quarterly, primarily that would be on the permittee, but it is possible, I think with the MSGP, they might get reminders sent to them when things are due. So we can look into whether that's possible to have for this. In terms of the enforceability, well, option 2 is just, the requirement is to collect the turbidity data. So assuming you're collecting the data, you're in compliance and submitting the reports. Under the benchmark, that is not, whether you're above 50 or not is not an enforceable. Under the current way it's written, it's not a limit. It's a benchmark would be used for the to guide the permittee on whether they needed to take further action to improve the controls or if something's wrong at the site. So whether it's above or below wouldn't be an enforcement issue. It's just, did you collect the data? If it was above, if the average weekly amount was above 50, did you do the corrective action that was required? That would be enforceable. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I apologize to the question asker if we did. The next question is, what are examples of erosion resistant surfaces?
I think what we're looking for is to not have your control be placed on a unstabilized surface. So it can be on some kind of padding or rock or something like that, or to be on some kind of vegetated surface, but not to be on open soil. And we've seen the BMPs used being put on areas that are unstabilized, and that itself leads to greater sediment discharge.
Thanks.
But
next question. Before
you go on, if we need to elaborate on this, even in guidance or if that would be helpful, that would be something useful to hear about from folks.
Okay. The next question is, regarding dewatering and inspecting daily when discharging, does, quote, discharging mean the discharge is going off-site, e.g. into receiving water or MS4, or just being produced and potentially being retained on-site?
When we think of discharge, we think of discharge off the site. Yeah, so it would be, if the discharge is to a drainage system that's going through an MS4, it would be the discharge from the site. If it's being retained on site, I'd question whether we've got a discharge or not. And hopefully I'm not misunderstanding the question, but basically, most of these discharges are being directed offsite. We would think of those as discharges, and that's what we're thinking about having be monitored and controlled.
Thank you. The next question is, on the dewatering monitoring proposal, does EPA's economic analysis for the permit address, i.e. estimate the compliance costs for CGP operators performing turbidity monitoring, either benchmark or indicated monitoring, can you please tell us where in EPA's economic analysis for the 2022 proposed CGP this information can be found?
Yeah, so the economic analysis is in the docket that I was talking about before. So you would go to regulations.gov and you would plug in our docket number, which you'll find in one of the first few slides of the presentation. And it's one of the documents that's posted. Maddie, you might be able to confirm for me, but I think we have information in there about the costs of instruments and what the costs would be of implementing turbidity monitoring.
Yes, that was included in the cost impact analysis, and
Right.
we'll check the docket to make sure it's there.
Right. So that, and the economic analysis, by the way, is considered part of the proposed permit. So that's something you can also look at too for comment.
Great, thank you. And just again, in the interest of time, I think that we might have to move on to the slides again. I apologize if we missed your question. We'll do our best to address them later on. And finally, just once again, we're sorry if you are unable to see these slides in the chat box, but at a future date, the slides and recording will be posted to EPA's website. Thanks.
Zach, also after, if they're unable to get it and they want to email, I have my email address as the last slide. And maybe you can jot that down and email me and I can get them a copy.
Oh, great, thank you.
Okay, am I moving on?
Yes.
Okay. So we're still talking about the proposed changes. The next set of changes have to do with inspections and corrective actions on construction sites. The first has to do with snowfall events. And there is an option, you have two basic options for conducting inspection on the site. You can either do them weekly or you can do them every other week. But if you choose the every other week, then you also need to inspect within 24 hours of a 1/4 inch rain event, or if there's snow melt runoff that results in a discharge. So that's in the current permit. There was questions asked to EPA about whether, given that the snow melt thing requires that you actually have someone kind of know when the snow melt runoff is occurring, the suggestion was that it would be useful to have an amount of snow that's equivalent to the 1/4 inch rain event that could be used as a guideline for when to trigger inspections. So we thought that was a good idea. Ultimately, snowfall is a little tricky because if you've got a snowfall event, it's really the discharge that we're focused on. So it's really whenever that snowfall melts is when we would want to make sure that the site is being controlled properly. But what we ended up finding through NOAA is that there is an equivalent amount, which is 3.25 inches or greater of snow. So if you've got, the proposal includes this as a trigger for inspection. If you've got that much snow and you've got a discharge from snowmelt from that, then you would do an inspection. So, and we include some guidelines on how to measure 3.25 inches. There's some suggested ways to do that. But basically, that's it. Just a clarification of what snowfall amounts would be. We mentioned before about arid, semi-arid, and drought-stricken areas, but there's inspection requirements for seasonally dry periods in arid or semi-arid areas. This is language we've had for a while, but basically if you're in one of these areas, you have a different inspection frequency during what's referred to as the seasonally dry period, that area. We haven't defined what seasonally dry period means in the past. So this was difficult to implement from our perspective and also hard to understand from the permittee's perspective. So we did some research into this, and the proposal includes a specific definition, which basically is a month in which the long-term average total precipitation is less than or equal to 1/2 inch of rain. And we are also putting out a tool for permittees to use, and I've included the link here to check it out, but you basically search by zip code where your site is, and it would tell you if you're in an arid or semi-arid area, and then whether there are months out of the year that are considered seasonally dry. And if that's the case, then during those months, if your construction is occurring during those months, then your inspection frequency would be, I think, monthly, once a month. Moving on to the next set of changes, we also, under the current permit, when you conduct an inspection, you're required to look for signs of erosion or sedimentation that are attributable to your discharge at points of discharge. What we're proposing to add is that the permittee also look for signs of sedimentation at points downstream from the site, and if it's attributable to the discharge. And we're not asking people to walk the stream necessarily, but from points that are visible from your site and obviously attributable to the discharge, such as things like sandbars with no vegetation. That's obviously an accumulation of sediment from probably some storm event, possibly from a construction site. So those are things to look for. And we've added that to the permit as a proposed additional thing to do for your inspection. Another thing we're emphasizing for this permit is training. The previous permit, the current permit requires that you have a qualified person on the site conducting inspections, and that person is someone who basically has an understanding of stormwater controls and how to conduct inspections and how to spot problems. We have found as EPA that inspections are an area that could be improved. There's not great documentation of whether these are occurring. Not everywhere. There's a number of sites that do a really great job with this, but the ones that don't, there's no evidence that they're doing the inspections at all. And so one way we're thinking in the proposal to improve this is to provide clarification on what kind of training would be necessary. So instead of the qualified person, which was kind of difficult to define, instead, we're requiring that any personnel conducting inspections either complete EPA's construction inspection course and pass the exam that we'll have, or hold a valid construction inspection certification from another licensing program. And there's a number of them out there that do this. So that they would need to address some of the same things that we would be addressing, but basically those are things like the principles of erosion and sediment control, proper design and installation of controls, and performing inspections. EPA is in the process of developing an online course that would be available to anyone needing to comply with this requirement. We'll have that for the permit. It's going to be available in English and Spanish. It'll have an exam associated with it. It's kind of thing you can just log on to our website and take it if you need to have that. And that would, if you pass it, it would constitute compliance with this requirement. Also, there's the proposal would differentiate between routine maintenance and corrective action. Before, we didn't really say what we meant by routine maintenance. And the permit requires that if you need to do routine maintenance, do it by the end of the next business day. But we don't really say what that is. We do say how long you have to do it. And if it's not something you can do by that time, then you need to do corrective action, which is a little bit more involved. You have to do some paperwork to finish that. So The idea was to define this routine maintenance as repairs or replacements of controls that can be done within 24 hours. If it takes longer than that, then you would need to do that under corrective action. Also, if you're finding that you're doing the same routine maintenance over and over again, and we suggest 3 or more times, that would require a more taking a closer look under corrective action to see if it's the control or if something else is wrong. And if the control was not designed or installed correctly, that would be something to do under corrective action as well. Okay. There's also a clarification in the permit that that inspection reports and corrective action logs, as we call them, or any of these records could be kept electronically. We have been silent on that in the past and found that enough people are asking us about it. We did clarify on our website that you can keep these electronically as long as they're as reliable as paper records. But in the proposed permit, we include language in the permit itself to clarify that electronic records are acceptable. I'm going to stop there again, see if we have any questions before we move on to the last section.
Sure. We have a couple questions. First one being, does EPA plan to have a cost associated with the online training course and testing? Will a certification be issued once the course is passed?
For EPA's course, there would not be any charge associated with it. And there would be, providing the person passes the exam, there will be a certificate that they can print out to constitute their evidence that they passed the exam, and they'd want to have that kept somewhere.
Thank you. The next question is, for inspection, will PE or PA also need certification?
What was that again, Zach? Would a what? Would a professional engineer, basically?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Would a professional engineer meet the qualifications? Is that the question?
I believe so. They just mentioned PE or PA, so.
Okay. Not in and of itself, and I think that probably in reality, there's a lot of people out there that have taken courses through a number of commercially available inspection courses out there. If you've already done that, if you've basically you're up to date on that, that would meet the requirements.
Okay, thank you. And the question asker clarified that they meant professional engineer.
Okay.
The next question is, have you considered raising the storm amount from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch? 1/4 inch has not produced a significant amount of rainfall runoff in my experience.
We didn't take that up under this proposal. I know that a couple permit cycles ago, 1/4 inch was found to be a level at which produced discharge on a large number of sites. And I didn't do the analysis. I just remember hearing about it. I do think that that's a legit area. One of the challenges EPA has is that we cover all these vastly different areas with different landscapes and different climates. 1/4 inch in some dry climates can be enough to cause a washout, whereas in other areas maybe not. So we have to kind of balance out a number of considerations. But if you've got data on that we could take a look at, I'd welcome that.
Thanks. The next question is EPA's expectation that EPA delegated states that don't currently have stormwater inspection training requirements follow EPA's proposed training requirements when those states' CGP come up for reauthorization?
No, I don't. It's not our expectation that that authorized states that have their own CGPs would be required to adopt the training requirements that we have. A number of states have their own training requirements. Some actually, they specify, go out and get this specific training. Some have their own trainings. So we, it's not really our place to dictate that to other states. But if you're a state that if you're one of the 3 states that we're covering, construction sites in those states would be required to have it. But if you're not, and you're in another state and you're required to get another CGP, they're likely going to have a different requirement, and that's fine.
Thank you. The next question is, when will training/courses be available or expected to be conducted?
Our hope would be that we'd have it available as close to permit finalization as possible. Obviously, if we don't have the training available, we'll have to look and make sure that there's a reasonable requirement in the interim. But our intent is to have it available as close as possible to the date when we issue the permit.
Thank you. Another question is, will the certificate expire, or will a certified professional need to take refresher training?
EPA's program would be good for the permit cycle. So it would be, this training would be for the 2022 CGP. If you've got a person that's passed the test, they could use that on projects that are needing to comply with the 2022 CGP. And likely the training would be updated for the next one. Not sure that answered the question, but that's what I thought they were getting at.
Thanks. Well, I think that we should probably move on to the slides again, just for the interest of time.
Okay.
I'd like to thank everyone for submitting questions.
All right, one more section here to go over. Thanks for the great questions, by the way. So these are, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's about 8 requests for public comment. I've mentioned a few of them. I'm not mentioning all of them, but just know that if you're reviewing the permit, they'll be highlighted in blue. There'll be 8 of these peppered throughout the permit where we're asking the public for specific questions. But these are a few I wanted to highlight. One has to do with the definition of operator. The definition of operator under the CGP is important because these are the people that are, if you've got a regulated construction site, it's the operator that needs to get permit coverage. They are the one that's legally liable under the permit. And that entity needs to submit an NOI, and they're the ones that are going to be covered. An operator can either be someone who has operational control over the site, and including the ability to make modifications to the plans and specifications. It can also be a person that has day-to-day operational control of the activities that are necessary for permit compliance. So those can be a number of different types of parties. Important to remember that under the EPA permit at least, there can be and often are more than one operator on a site. So there could be let's say the municipal government whose project it is, they're an operator, as well as the general contractor they're hiring to do the project. There's been a concern out there among some regulated parties that the party that pays for work performed sometimes aren't understanding that they are considered an operator, even though under the definition they would be. The issue is whether the definition needs to be tweaked or modified to emphasize that that's the case. In reality, we've heard that this can be a problem if, for a general contractor, for instance, if that other person isn't on the permit, there's often problems if there needs to be more paid for stormwater controls. These are just things we're hearing about, so we're putting forward the request for comments to ask whether the definition of operator should be modified to make sure that it's understood that persons that determine acceptance of work and payment for work to ensure permit compliance are considered an operator. And in other questions, we're asking specifically, is the existing definition adequate enough to cover those areas? So this is something we ask up front. It's one of the first things you'll see in a proposed permit. We also ask about the waiting period for permit coverage. Currently, there is, if you submit an NOI under EPA CGP, there's a 14-day waiting period. And among other things, during that period of time, the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service are able to look at the NOI to see if there's any concerns about impacts to endangered species. So as I said, there's a 14-day waiting period. The question is, should EPA extend that to 30 days? And if not, if you're opposed to that, how that would affect you? The idea of this has come from the services that are doing these reviews have found the 14 days is sometimes tight. Could we extend that period of time? And we wanted to request comment on that because we've had 14 days for a few permit cycles. And so we wanted to take the public's temperature on that. This has to do with stabilization timeframes. We, in the last permit, we structured the stabilization timeframes in a way so that if you're disturbing more than 5 acres of land, you would have a shorter period of time, 7 days, to stabilize the site, versus if you're disturbing 5 acres or less. The idea being that EPA has always found that phasing of construction is a useful erosion control. The less you open up at any one time, the better, just from a pollutant standpoint. What we've heard that requirement has not really made a difference in the field. That most people are just going out and doing the amount of disturbance they need to do, whether or not it's 5 acres. We thought this would be a good opportunity to request comment on whether the 5 acre threshold is proving to be an effective incentive to phase construction. If so, if it has been effective, how have you changed your practices to kind of operate around the 5 acres? And if not, what alternative threshold might be more effective? In addition, we just wanted to put some other concepts out for comment. Some states actually cap disturbances at 10 acres at any one time. So asking for feedback on that, and kind of related to that, if 10 acres was considered a good idea, whether there should be a case-by-case exception with additional requirements. So that's that one. I think this is the last one. We've made it to the end. This has to do with pollution prevention, whether additional flexibilities should be given to certain construction wastes. Under the current permit, for storage of building materials and products, pollution prevention practices are not necessary if exposure to precipitation will not result in the discharge of pollutants. And you can think of things like wood and lumber, concrete blocks, rebar, things that can be stored outside where there's not really there's not a contamination risk. So there's that flexibility written into the permit. It's actually embedded into the federal standard as well for these materials. But if for the waste remnant of those same materials, so the unused portion, the things that you cut that you don't use, that you're storing on site, the question is, should that same exception apply to those remnant materials under any circumstances? So we're requesting feedback on that. And what types of materials, if you believe this is something EPA should do, would not result in a discharge of pollutants, and why? And then how should the permit ensure that the storage of those types of materials is kept separate from other waste materials that could discharge pollutants? These are areas that we're asking for feedback on. We're not including a specific proposed change, but asking for feedback on that. And we've come to the end. Here's my contact information. It's also on the website, but I'll see if there's any additional questions. We have time.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. I would also just like to invite anyone who has their hand raised to put their question in the question box, just for the sake of time. It might just be easier to put them in the box so we have it on record as well. And on to the actual questions. So the first one that I have is, does EPA propose that a pass-through grant funding agency like EPA or an accountant now be a, quote, operator?
Sorry, Zach, I'm having trouble hearing that one. Can you repeat it again? Talk a little louder. It's not your fault, it's my computer, I'm sure.
Sure. So is this better?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. The question was, does EPA propose that a pass-through grant funding agency like EPA or an accountant now be an operator?
Maybe I need a better understanding of what types of entities we're talking about, but by your description, I'm not seeing the, I think what would be lacking under the definition would be operational control. Just to go back to this, if you see here, but regardless of the type of operator, you need operational control over the project. And if it's just a pass through of money to entities that are building, I don't think that would constitute an operator. Just my gut instinct on that, based on what the question was like.
Thank you. The next question is, when recommending turbidity monitoring, are you taking into consideration turbidity of the receiving stream? There are many streams that will have high turbidity naturally on rainy days.
As it was written in the proposal, we would not take into consideration the natural background levels. I understand the question. I think it's a good area for comment. What we were looking for is a benchmark that for the discharge itself would indicate whether it's likely to be high, whether we consider that to be high or low before it even gets into the receiving stream. But there is some precedence for using background levels. I know the MSGP has pollutants that they for the benchmark monitoring part, there is a natural background consideration. So I think I would encourage folks to shed light on that if they have thoughts in that area.
Thank you. The next question is, what happened to the US EPA proposed 280 NTU from the 2009 Construction and Development Effluent Guidelines and Standards final rule that was removed from the proposed rule, and now the US EPA proposes lowering it to 50 NTU?
That turbidity threshold was ultimately removed from the effluent guideline, and EPA. I didn't work directly on that, but I believe the agency said they needed to evaluate the that level more. But in effect, it was removed. It's no longer a number that's effective or enforceable. And what we're considering is not a discharge limitation. It would be just a benchmark. It would be a benchmark that would be used to inform the permittee on what levels are coming off of their site.
Got it.
And the other thing, the context was a little bit different for that. A little bit different in that they were basing the turbidity levels on a type of treatment technology for sediment basins. This is a little different in that we're talking about dewatering discharges. So it's slightly different, even though they're all coming from construction sites, it's a little bit different.
Got it. The next question is, would it be possible for the permitting agency to reject the NOT if the submitted pictures do not meet the minimum standards? Back to the NOT and pictures topic.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would be if the stabilization was inadequate and the pictures were showing that, I think it would really it would be hard for EPA not to view that as a potential violation. I mean, obviously, sites are going to be different. There might be circumstances that we don't fully know, but it's something that we're going to be looking at, and it probably is an issue where we'd want to follow up with the permittee to find out what was going on. I don't think that we'd be, if for instance it was found that this was a violation, there are a number of ways we could respond to that, and I can't really kind of speak to that, but it would really call into question whether the NOT was proper and whether the site shouldn't have continued to operate under the CGP because the site wasn't stabilized.
Thank you. A question related to that is, how many NOT photos would be required? For long utility projects, the area of impact can be extensive.
Right. The requirement in the permit actually uses the term representative of the site. And I think that could be an area we elaborate on. The linear projects and other kinds of projects can be really tough here to capture in one photograph. I think EPA is willing to be a little bit flexible here, where the photographs were represented, the photographs being submitted were representative of the stabilization occurring in other parts. And this is an area we've asked for public comment on. This is the first time we're venturing into this type of requirement, so we're interested in ideas on how to make it implementable. So that's something we considered, but I would look at the language used around representative as potentially a way we could work with this.
Thank you. Another question is, does EPA's proposed CGP permit create any new e-reporting rule data elements that will need to be added to Appendix A, NPDES e-reporting rule?
No, this is not affecting the e-reporting rule itself, which the e-reporting rule establishes minimum data elements that the states and permittees need to, that are required to report electronically to the states and EPA. I'm not an expert on this, but what the requirement for e-reporting is based on the regulations. So because this is a permit and it's not, we're issuing permits based on the regulations, but we're not modifying the regulations per se. We're just modifying this version of the permit. We aren't modifying the e-reporting data elements.
Thank you. Another question is, regarding proposed dewatering activities requirements, inspections and documentation, i.e. estimating the volume of dewatering activity and taking photos, does EPA require only certain individuals, that is those trained in stormwater inspections, to be present? Frequently, dewatering activities are performed by subcontractors, utility personnel, etc. In these instances, the CGP permit holder / operator might be present at the precise time, or I assume might not be present at the precise time the dewatering activity occurs.
Great question. That is a good consideration. I think the so while dewatering is occurring on the site, there may or may not be, the inspector might not be there the whole time. That wasn't our, I don't think that was our intent, that the inspector, if that's different from the person running the dewatering operation, have to be there. I'd be interested in views on how it would make sense. To me, a subcontractor that's or anyone who's handling the dewatering part of it could be, and they're kind of operating under kind of the guidance of some trained inspector that's maybe not there on site. They could be given the ability to kind of take notes, take the pictures, take notes of the start and stop time, and then hand that over to the inspector who puts it in the inspection report. I think there's something workable around that, but I'm interested. It sounds like the person asking knows a lot about this, and I'd be interested in what they would suggest would be the best way to work with the realities of how these dewatering operations are staffed.
Thank you. The next question is, could you say more about the possibility of prohibiting dewatering from a site with the potential for contaminants? In my interpretation, any site would have the potential for naturally occurring groundwater contamination. So this is essentially requiring a separate permit for all dewatering activities. Is that correct?
I'm probably going to be answering the question and not fully understanding. We are not, so, okay, so there's a, you have to be eligible for coverage under the CGP overall. So if you're, again, if you're going to be doing dewatering at a site that's regulated because it's disturbing 1 acre or more, then this would be a permit you could use to have your groundwater dewatering discharges covered. And there actually is, in EPA has its own dewatering permit in New England that regulates sites that aren't covered under the CGP as a separate matter. So if you're not covered by the CGP, but you have dewatering discharges, you would likely need a separate permit for discharging pollutants. And if you're in New England, there is a permit available that you could use for that. I'm not sure if I've completely answered the right question, but that's what made sense to me. If you have other questions about this, feel free to get in touch.
The next question is, the proposed permit states to check also for signs of sedimentation, e.g. sandbars with no vegetation growing on top, at points downstream from the point of discharge that could be attributable to your discharge. This may not be practically possible. It may require access to private land. What are EPA's expectations on this?
Yeah, we do not have the expectation that you would need to, as I was mentioning before, do extensive walking of streams. I think and also from a private property perspective, nor do we expect that you have to access, if viewing downstream requires access onto private property, it's not the expectation that you do that. I think what we're hoping to build into this requirement is that you're already going to be down at the stream looking at the point of discharge and the banks around the discharge. If you're looking downstream from what you can see from your site, and it looks like, yeah, there's a pollutant issue, there's sedimentation happening, that's something we want you to note. We talked about that here before. It was difficult to kind of contain that around some of the issues that might exist, like private property. I would say advise us about some of these issues that we can hope to have as considerations in the final permit.
Got it. The next question is about dewatering, and it is, did EPA propose that operators monitor the dewatering water prior to discharge, or in stream at the point of discharge, or downstream?
At the point of discharge. So not downstream, not prior to discharge, but at the point of discharge.
Thanks. Next question is, how will EPA verify that the commercial courses taken are adequate and met EPA's requirements?
Well, the way we included in the, we included a description of things that at a minimum the course should have in it. And we tried to capture what we thought was out there and that would meet the needs of the permit. Obviously, the commercially available programs out there aren't going to be written specifically for our permit, especially for this new permit. So I hopefully take a look and see how we've described what these programs should have. I think we would have to be pretty flexible, but the programs that we know of that are out there are high quality and have been in operation for a long time. And so we very much wanted to acknowledge that those are out there and that those could be adequate too. I guess that's all I can really say is that we're going to kind of leave it generally out there. But if you have suggestions on additional assurances or better language to use to capture that, we're open.
Thank you. Next question is, page 31 of the proposed permit contains a footnote. Quote, inspection reports may be prepared, signed, and kept electronically rather than in paper form, if the records are, and so on, end quote. Can you expand on the electronic retention of records and what records can be electronically retained?
Zach, I missed what the quote was.
Oh, sure. I'll read it again. Inspection reports.
What was the quoted part of the text that was in the comment?
It was, inspection reports may be prepared, signed, and kept electronically rather than in paper form.
Oh, okay. So the intention is to allow permittees to electronically keep their inspection records, their corrective action records, and any of their SWIP documents electronically. And there's some criteria for them being the equivalent of paper, but basically, as long as they're kind of, the idea is as long as they're available in an equivalent way to paper, and have this same kind of legal effect of the right people signing and things like that, that's something that is perfectly acceptable.
Thank you. And it looks like we have maybe time for 3 more questions. The first of which is the proposed 10-acre disturbance cap related to / permitted by the quote C&D rule? It seems that it may be a regulatory stretch to cap disturbance solely under the Clean Water Act.
So the question about 10-acre disturbance, I think there are some legitimate questions about how to implement a 10-acre cap, which again, we didn't propose, we were just asking for comment on because there are states that have a acreage cap in their permits. There is, the language in the permit having to do with erosion control and sediment control. I don't have the reg language in front of me, but that's an issue we'd have to look at, whether implementing a hard cap like that is something that we could do at the federal level, but it is one of the options available. The linkage for us would be on, limiting large disturbances at any one time as an erosion control. But, obviously we're putting it out for comment. If there are concerns that you want to put before us, those are all kind of open for us for you to comment on.
Thank you. Next, we have, will each subcontractor responsible for a different BMP be required to file its own NOI?
In general, we don't say that subcontractors are operators. However, that's why we kind of rely less on something like words like owners and contractors and subcontractors, because it really depends on whether they have the operational control at the site. If they're being paid by someone with that operational control, and they're really just kind of installing and maintaining under the supervision of the operator, then I would tend to say that they're not an operator, but I might need to understand more about the scenario. But that's my gut instinct.
Got it. Thank you.
There's I'll just say there's lots of scenarios out there. This has been an issue of hot debate over the years about the level of legal responsibility for different entities. So I would say, since we've asked for comment on operator, if you've got scenarios in mind where they are or aren't operators, like, please submit that to EPA for us to consider.
Okay. And then one more is a question on public comments / EPA's request for comments. Did EPA intend to make substantial changes to the proposed draft CGP after reviewing responses to the detailed 8 EPA's request for comments?
Well, we're governed by certain kind of restrictions after we propose a permit, because we've only put certain issues in front of the public for you to comment on. And, so we operate under constraints under how much we could actually modify. Obviously, we've put a lot of things out for comment. Any of the changes we put out, plus the request for comment, these are all things that we'll take into consideration. But kind of overriding all of that, we need to be cognizant of the types of issues we put the public on notice about. So I can't really say how substantially we can change it. It really depends on the comments that come in. The comment period ends on July 12th, and we'll just have to see what the range of comments that there were on things, on whether to go forward on some things, or whether to slightly modify things based on good points that were raised in the comments. But we have to be cautious about how much we can change from the proposal.
Well, thank you. And it looks like we're just about out of time. I would like to, again, thank everyone for joining and put out a reminder that this recording and the PDF slides will be posted to the 2022 CGP webpage at a later date. And thank you, Greg.
Thanks, everyone.